You reach for that one can you always keep in the back of the pantry, and the shelf where it used to sit is bare again. Not sold out for a day, bare for weeks. You tell yourself it is nothing, just a shipping hiccup, and then you notice the same gap in 3 more aisles. Here is the part I did not believe until I tested it myself. Nearly every food quietly disappearing from store shelves right now can be kept safe and edible at home for years, using methods your great-grandmother trusted for pennies compared to what a case of it costs today. I doubted that completely. I thought old food storage was a myth wrapped in nostalgia. The kind of thing people brag about but never actually eat. These methods survived because they had to. They fed families through winters with no trucks, no freezers, and no grocery chain to run to. And by the end of this, I am going to hand you one preservation trick I found buried in a United States Department of Agriculture bulletin from 1943, a wartime document most people have never read that shocked me more than anything else I tried. Everything I am about to show you works with jars, salt, and things already sitting in your kitchen tonight. I still remember standing in my own kitchen last winter, holding a dusty quart jar of green beans I had put up 11 months earlier as a joke to prove my aunt wrong, absolutely certain it had gone bad. It had not. That single jar is why I am talking to you right now. Let me start with the one that got me into this, because it is the food everyone assumes you simply cannot keep. I assumed eggs were hopeless. You buy them, you refrigerate them, and you use them within a few weeks, or you throw them out. That was my whole understanding, and I would have argued it with anyone. Eggs vanish from shelves faster than almost anything when supply gets tight and the price swings are brutal. I watched a dozen go from under $2 to over $5 in a single season, and I figured there was nothing to be done but pay it. Then I found something that stopped me cold. Long before refrigeration existed, people kept eggs fresh for 6 to 9 months without any electricity at all. The method is called water glassing, and it uses a mineral compound called sodium silicate. Here is the history that made me take it seriously. In 1933, researchers documented farm families across the American Midwest storing their spring egg surplus this way to eat straight through winter. The United States government published storage guidance on it because it mattered to national food supply. This was not folklore. This was standard practice that got erased the moment every home had a refrigerator. So I tested it, fully expecting to gag. I took fresh, unwashed eggs, the kind straight from a farm with the natural bloom still on the shell, because that protective coating is the whole secret. I mixed 1 part sodium silicate into 11 parts cool boiled water. I lowered the eggs gently into a glass jar, made sure they were fully submerged, sealed it, and set it in a cool corner of my basement. Then I waited, honestly forgetting about them for months. At 7 months, I cracked one into a pan, braced for the smell. There was no smell. The white was slightly looser than a brand new egg, but it fried up. It tasted like an egg, and I ate the whole thing and felt fine the next morning. I had spent about $4 on the sodium silicate, and that same batch could preserve dozens of eggs. I had genuinely believed this was impossible, and I was wrong in the most useful way. But that raised a bigger question in my mind. If eggs could be beaten this easily, what about the foods that cost the most and disappear the fastest? Because the next one hits your wallet far harder. Meat. That was the wall I was sure I would hit. I assumed that without a deep freezer, keeping meat was either dangerous or disgusting, and probably both. Meat is expensive. It is one of the first things people panic buy when shelves thin out, and a freezer full of it is worthless the moment the power goes down for 3 days. That last part is what actually scared me into experimenting. What I learned is that people preserved meat safely for centuries with nothing but salt, and they did it as a matter of survival. There is a method called salt curing, and another called confit, where meat is cooked slowly in its own fat and then sealed under that fat, which locks out the air that spoils it. In the 1700s and 1800s, entire ship voyages and winter households ran on salt pork stored in wooden barrels for a year or more. Sailors crossed oceans on it. The knowledge did not vanish because it stopped working. It vanished because the freezer aisle made us forget. Now, I will be honest with you because I share your caution. This is the one where you follow the ratios exactly, no guessing. I started small and simple with a salt cure on pork belly. I took coarse salt, mixed in a little sugar, rubbed it thoroughly over the meat, and packed it so every surface was coated. I kept it cold, around 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and I turned it every day, pouring off the liquid that the salt pulled out. That liquid coming out is the salt doing its job, drawing out the moisture that bacteria need to survive. After about 7 days, the belly was firm, dense, and completely transformed. Rinsed, dried, and sliced thin, it cooked into something close to bacon, and it kept for weeks in a cool place without a single volt of electricity. The cost was almost nothing beyond the salt. I stood there realizing that a skill people once considered as basic as boiling water had been quietly deleted from an entire generation, mine included. And that is the moment the anger started to creep in, because I began asking who benefited from me not knowing this. Hold that thought, because it gets sharper. Here is what I could not stop thinking about. Every one of these methods was common knowledge within living memory. My own grandparents used them. So why did I reach adulthood convinced they were dangerous or fake? That did not happen by accident. Somewhere along the way, it became far more profitable for us to buy fresh every week, to depend on the refrigerator, the freezer, and the 24-hour store than for us to know how to keep our own food. A household that can preserve its own harvest is a household that buys less. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just what happens when convenience becomes an industry and self-reliance becomes a lost hobby. Which brings me to the food that made me feel the most foolish forever doubting. Butter. I assumed butter had to stay cold or it would turn rancid within days. Everyone knows that, right? Butter disappears fast in shortages, dairy prices climb, and a stick left on the counter seems like a gamble. I believed keeping butter shelf-stable for a year was flat out impossible. Then I read about canning butter and a technique for something called ghee, which is butter with the milk solids removed, and I found references to shelf-stable butter going back well over a century in kitchens across India and Europe, where refrigeration simply was not available. The milk solids are what spoil. Remove them, and the pure butter fat can sit at room temperature for a very long time. This was ordinary knowledge in millions of homes for generations. So I made ghee on my own stove, terrified I would poison myself. I melted unsalted butter over low heat and let it gently bubble. The water cooked off, the milk solids sank and turned golden brown, and I strained the clear liquid gold through a cloth into a clean jar. That was the entire process. It cost me nothing but a pound of butter I already had. I left that jar in my cupboard, not the refrigerator, for 4 months as a test. It never turned. It smelled nutty and sweet, and I cooked with it the whole time. 1 pound of butter I might have watched spoil in a week became a jar of cooking fat that outlasted the season. I had been throwing away softened butter my whole life out of fear that came from nowhere but habit. If what you have heard so far, the water-glassed eggs, the salt-cured meat, the homemade ghee, has made you want to go deeper into these methods, I put everything I tested, with the exact ratios, steps, and sourcing notes, into a book called Smart Basics, part of the Deep Frugal System Complete Library. You will find the link in the description below. What I want you to know is that this is not a collection of tips scraped together. It is the same hands-on process you are watching right now, written out so you can follow it in your own kitchen without rewinding a video. And that brings us right back to where this journey keeps leading. the everyday staples, the ones people panic buy first. But butter and eggs and meat are proteins and fats. What about the everyday staples? The boring ones that vanish first and fastest when people get nervous. That is where I found the biggest gap between what I assumed and what was true. Cheese. I was certain cheese was a refrigerator prisoner, that it would mold or sweat into a greasy mess if left out. Cheese disappears quickly in any shortage, and good cheese is not cheap. I never imagined you could keep it shelf stable. Then I learned about waxing cheese, a method that is genuinely ancient. Hard cheeses were coated in wax and stored in cool cellars for months, even years, long before anyone had a cold box humming in the kitchen. The wax seals out air and locks in moisture, and the cheese continues to age and deepen in flavor rather than spoil. Trading ships carried waxed wheels across the world. This was infrastructure, not a party trick. I tried it with a block of hard cheddar. I melted cheese wax in a small pot, and using a natural bristle brush, I painted 2 thin coats over every side of the block, letting each coat cool and harden before the next. Then I set it in the coolest part of my basement. Months later, I cut into it, and beneath the wax, the cheese was perfect, sharper, and more flavorful than the day I sealed it. The whole thing cost me a few dollars of wax I can reuse. I had walked past waxed cheese in stores my entire life and never once wondered why it was waxed. Now I knew. And now I need to talk to the person watching this who is quietly thinking that all of this sounds like it requires a farm, a cellar, special supplies, and money you do not have. I heard that voice in my own head too. So this next part is built specifically for you, using only what is already in your kitchen, with nothing to buy. Because here is the truth I stumbled into. The single most powerful food preservation tool in human history is sitting in a cardboard cylinder in your cabinet right now. It is salt, plain salt. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any of it, salt was how humanity survived winter, and it costs almost nothing. Let me show you the simplest thing you can do tonight with no equipment. Take any fresh herbs you have that are about to wilt and go to waste, the parsley or cilantro slumping in your refrigerator drawer, chop them, mix them with an equal weight of salt, and pack them into any jar with a lid. The salt pulls the water out, and without water, nothing can rot. You've just made a salted herb blend that will keep for the better part of a year and season your cooking the whole time. I did this with a bunch of parsley I would have thrown out, and I was still using it 9 months later. Now try lemons, which is where I really became a believer. Preserved lemons are a centuries-old method from North Africa, and they need exactly 2 things you have: lemons and salt. I quartered lemons most of the way through, packed them hard with salt, crammed them into a jar, and pushed them down until their own juice rose up and covered them. I sealed the jar and left it on the counter. Over several weeks, the whole thing transformed. The rinds went soft and silky, the flavor turned deep and almost floral, and they kept for a year without refrigeration. Total cost, a few lemons and a handful of salt. Here's the part that convinced me salt was the real hidden hero. There is a study line of research from food scientists showing that salt preserves food by drawing out moisture through a process called osmosis, dropping what they call water activity so low that bacteria and mold physically cannot grow. It is not magic, and it is not luck. It is basic science that worked 500 years ago and works identically tonight in your kitchen with no machine and no cord to plug in. So if you take nothing else from me, take this. You are not helpless when the shelves go bare. You have salt, you have jars, and you have more power over your own food than anyone ever taught you. But salt led me down a road, and at the end of that road was the discovery that genuinely changed how I see my own kitchen, the one I promised you from that wartime document. Stay with me, because this is the payoff. Before I get there, I need to cover the staples that empty out first in every single shortage, because you have watched it happen. Flour, rice, beans, and dry pasta. The moment people get nervous, These aisles stripped bare, and I always assumed dry goods just quietly went bad in the pantry, that flour got stale and buggy and there was nothing to do but rotate it fast and hope. I was wrong about how long these can last, and the difference is staggering. Properly stored, white rice, dried beans, and white flour can last not months, but years, and in some cases decades. The enemy is not time. The enemy is oxygen, moisture, and light. Remove those three, and dry staples enter a kind of suspended sleep. The old method here is beautifully simple. Our ancestors stored grain in sealed containers, kept cool and dark, and the key insight is that living things, including the insects that ruin flour, need oxygen to survive. Take away the air and you take away the spoilage. I tested this with the plainest setup imaginable. I filled clean glass jars with white rice and dried beans, and to pull the oxygen down I used a simple trick. I placed a small oxygen absorber in each jar before sealing, and where I did not have those, I learned you can even use the age-old approach of adding a bit of dry ice at the bottom, letting the carbon dioxide push the oxygen out as it evaporates before you seal the lid. The jars I sealed 2 years ago are, as far as I can tell, identical to the day I filled them. No bugs, no staleness, no rancid smell, the rice cooked up exactly the same. I had been buying small bags and burning through them out of a fear of spoilage that proper storage completely erases. A large quantity of rice and beans, stored right, becomes a foundation under your family that just sits there quietly, costing you nothing after the day you seal it. And that is when the full picture hit me, and the anger came back sharper than before. We were sold the idea that food is something you must buy continuously, freshly, forever. We were taught to distrust our own pantries. An entire body of knowledge that made households independent got quietly repackaged as unsafe, old-fashioned, or not worth the trouble, precisely because a self-reliant family is a family that spends less every single week. The methods never failed us. We were just encouraged to forget them. Which brings me, finally, to the discovery I have been holding back, the one that made me sit down and rethink everything. I told you about a United States Department of Agriculture bulletin from 1943. Let me tell you how I found it and why it stunned me. During the Second World War, the American government needed civilians to preserve enormous amounts of food at home because commercial supplies were being routed to soldiers overseas. So they published detailed guidance teaching ordinary people in ordinary kitchens how to keep food safe without relying on stores. Millions of families followed it. It worked. And then, when the war ended and the supermarkets boomed, almost all of it was allowed to fade from memory. Buried in that era of home front guidance was the method that floored me, because it turns one of the most perishable foods on earth into something shelf-stable: whole eggs, dried into powder. I had always thought powdered eggs were a modern industrial invention, some factory product. They are not. Home cooks in wartime kitchens were drying eggs to preserve them, and the principle is the same one behind everything else I tested. Remove the water, and you remove the ability of anything to spoil. I did not believe it would taste like anything but sadness, so of course I tested it. I beat fresh eggs until they were completely smooth, poured them in a thin layer onto a lined tray, and dried them at the lowest possible heat until they went from liquid to a brittle, glassy sheet. Then I ground that sheet into a fine powder and sealed it in a jar with the air pushed out. To use it, I simply mixed the powder back with water, a spoonful of powder to a spoonful of water for each egg I wanted. The first time I scrambled reconstituted egg powder, I stood over the pan genuinely braced for failure. It scrambled. It tasted like scrambled eggs, not gourmet, but real food, real protein, indistinguishable enough that I would eat it any morning without complaint. And here is the part that put a knot in my throat. That jar of egg powder will keep for years in my pantry, needing no refrigeration, no freezer, no power. Eggs. The very thing I opened this whole journey believing were the most hopeless food to store turned out to be storable in not one but two ways our grandparents knew and we forgot. That is what the skeptic in me finally had to admit. This knowledge was not lost because it failed. It was preserved by people who lived through hard times, written down in documents like that 1943 bulletin, dismissed by a comfortable generation that thought the store would always be full, and now it is sitting in your hands because you stayed to the end. Let me pull it all together for the person still with me, because you just recovered something that was quietly taken from you, and I do not think you should ever give it back. You are not the kind of person who reads a price tag and simply accepts it. You are the kind who asks whether there is another way, an older way, a way that does not depend on a full shelf and a working freezer and a supply chain you cannot control. That is not paranoia. That is the exact instinct that carried your great-grandparents through winters and wars, and it still lives in you, or you would have clicked away 20 minutes ago. So I want to hear from you specifically. Of everything I tested, the water-glassed eggs, the salt-cured pork, the homemade ghee, the waxed cheese, the salted lemons, or that wartime egg powder, which one are you going to try first in your own kitchen? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you are watching from, because I genuinely want to know how far this old knowledge still reaches. If your grandmother had a method she swore by, put it down there too, because someone reading needs it. And if any part of this changed how you look at your own pantry, then you belong with the people who test the old ways instead of trusting the price tag, who would rather know how to feed their family than hope the shelf is full. That is what this is, not a channel. A quiet movement of people reclaiming what was deleted from us, one convenience at a time. Stay with me, because next I am putting an even bolder claim to the test. There is an old way to keep whole vegetables crisp and edible deep into winter using nothing but sand and a cool corner. No canning, no freezing, no power at all, and I did not believe a word of it until I dug up where it came from. I will show you exactly what happened when I tried it. Do not let them convince you that you need them for everything. You never did. So that's the overview, but here's where it really begins. Inside the Old Ways Almanac, I walk you through the full home storage playbook for all 9 foods, the way I did it in my own kitchen. And if you get stuck, ask me your own question, and I answer you myself, a real person. You won't be doing this alone. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen, cancel anytime, come join me. If this helped you get ahead, go ahead and subscribe. And stay right here with me. I've got plenty more simple ways to keep your pantry ready coming your way soon.